Okay, so for this lecture, we're going to be talking about more sophisticated quotations than some of the things you might have done so far. Some of this is going to be review, but it's always good to practice a little bit more with using some of these trickier types of quotes. So we're going to talk about adding words, taking words away, using block or long quote format, quote within a quote, and citing multiple sources at the same time. And then we're going to talk about something I call the does it flow or no rule, which is really important for quotations, and this has to do with your introduction to the quote. Okay, so adding words. We've talked about this before. Again, just use brackets whenever you want to add something. So here's our original source. And then when we quote it, you can see we want to just add some words in here for clarification. So the original source says, if people can band together in their concern for the environment, and so we want to just take a piece of that quote and we want to add, if environmentally conscious people can band together. So all we have to do is put brackets around whatever we're adding, and those brackets are like magic, and they tell your audience, these are my words, they're not coming from the original source. So that's all you have to do when you want to add information into your quotes. And usually you're going to add information in your quotes just to make them clearer or to make them grammatically correct, because they have your quotes need to fit grammatically correctly with the rest of your sentence. And notice we're introducing the author, we've got the page number in there. Taking words away, you use ellipses, which is that ... So we're dealing with the same quote, and now I'm going to show you, again, it was the exact same quote, but we want to leave some words out. If people can band together in their concern for the environment and boycott environmentally irresponsible companies, we can make a difference. So we want to now introduce our quote. Gordon, notice we're saying our author's name, Gordon believes boycotting can lead to change. If people can band together, we can make a difference. So this is leaving out half the sentence, and all we have to do is put those dots there. So that shows we're leaving stuff out. You use 3 dots whether you're leaving out one word or an entire paragraph. So if your source is long and you've got a lot of information between 2 sentences or pieces of sentences that you really like, just put them together and put that ... wherever you've left stuff out. It's as simple as that. And again, we've got our citation here with the page number at the end. And notice, I don't have the author's last name in parentheses because I've already introduced him here. So all I have to do is say his name one time and then I'm done. You can do both. You can add and take away in the same quote. Again, however you want to do it. Now don't do this randomly, don't do it just because, but if it's going to help the quote make more sense, help make it grammatically correct, and leave out a bunch of extra information that you don't want to include, by all means, use both of these strategies together. Block quotes. Again, we've already talked about this, and so here's where I want to mention that your Bridging the Difference book has a whole section on how to do in-text citations. In-text citations meaning quotes, summaries, and paraphrases, and it focuses mostly on quotes. So that starts on page 32 in your book, and this block quote format starts on page 35. So you don't have to memorize this stuff, you just have to know how to look it up. So it's in Bridging the Difference on page 35, or you can always Google long quote format or block quote format. So long quotes means it runs more than 4 lines within your paper. And so what you have to do, and this is not optional, these are the things that you have to do according to MLA format. You introduce the quote, so you'll have an introduction just like you normally would, but you always put a colon after your introduction. And then you'll hit enter, and it'll go down to the next line, and you'll hit tab. So you want to indent, starting with the first line, and you'll actually indent every line of the quote. You don't use quotation marks around it. and then you'll cite the quote, and this is the only time where you'll put the period before the parentheses instead of after. So here's our example. We've got our introduction, we've got our colon that leads into the introduction, and see, we go on to the next line. No matter where this part ends, even if reasons is the very first word and only word on a line, you still have to put a colon and go down to the next line. And see, we've tabbed over every single line here. We put the period at the end of the quote, and then we'll put in here in parentheses our citation, our author's name and page number. Quote within a quote. So this is when you're quoting a source that's quoting someone else. So you'll introduce the person who's being quoted. So you want to tell us who is saying this. And then in parentheses, you'll put QTD in, and that stands for quoted in. And that tells us, well, this source on your works cited, this is the person who actually interviewed the person you're quoting. So that's why you have to do this, is because if you say, according to John Doe, but then you don't have this QTD in, and you're not telling me which source on your work cited, and I don't see John Doe on your work cited, then I'm going to be confused and be like, well, where is the John Doe citation on your work cited? So that's going to make me think you left off a source. So that's why it's really important to do this correctly. So here's our example. Oops. According to Derek Anderson, an investigator for the Better Business Bureau, so we're telling here's the person who said it, here's the person's credentials, and then we have our quote, and then it says QTD in Gordon, and then the page number. So that shows, okay, this author, Gordon, who is going to be listed on your works cited page, he's the guy who actually interviewed Derek Anderson. And so that's how you keep that clear and make sure that your readers never get confused about what sources you're using and who's actually saying what and that sort of thing. Citing more than one source at the same time. So say you're summarizing multiple sources. All you have to do is put the names together, just the last name, in alphabetical order. And then if you have page numbers, you'll put the page numbers after each author's name, and you separate them with semicolons. So here's our simple example. The effects of sleep deprivation have been well documented. So if we've done a lot of research on sleep deprivation and we've looked at a lot of sources and they're all saying the same thing, and we want to show how many sources we've looked at that have said this, we can just in parentheses put each author, and if there's a page number, you'll put the page number there. If not, you just leave that out. We put the authors in alphabetical order, and we separate each author with a semicolon. And that shows here's all the different sources that we have that say the same thing. Does it flow or no? So this is my labeling for how your introduction leads into your actual quote. So if it flows grammatically correctly, the introduction flows grammatically correctly into the quote, you use a comma. If it doesn't, use a colon. And so we're going to look at some examples. So here's one where it does flow grammatically correctly. Joseph Schmidt, an attorney who specializes in identity theft, warns, quote, when people post their full name, address, and phone number on social networking sites, it's like they're asking to have their identity stolen. So notice this is one complete sentence. You can read it from beginning to end, from the introduction through the end of the quote, and it all flows together grammatically correctly. So we just put a comma after this signal phrase. Now here's an example that doesn't flow. Joseph Schmidt, an attorney who specializes in identity theft, warns about the dangers of putting personal information online. Quote, when people post their full name, blah, blah, blah. So it's the same quote, but this is a complete sentence. So you can't put a comma here. Why? Because that's a comma splice. That makes this a run-on sentence. You can't read the introduction through the end of the quote and have it flow grammatically correctly. So this is an example of this does not flow, and therefore we want to put a colon. Now, this is a good solution for lots of you who have a problem with having an introduction to your quote and putting a period and then starting with the quotation marks. So you're never supposed to just start with a quote. You're always supposed to have some kind of introduction, some kind of lead into the quote. But the good news is if you have some sentence that comes before the quote that sets it up for us, all you have to do is put a colon. So both of these are equally correct. One is not preferable to the other. The only difference is make sure you use the correct punctuation. Make sure you're looking at, do I need to use a comma here or do I need to use a colon? And once again, let's notice our setup for the quote. We've got the author's name, or at least, yeah, we can assume this is the author's name because we don't have QTD in here. So we've got the author's name, we've got a signal phrase here, or we've got just a full introduction here. We've got the quote, and then we've got our page number, and then we've got our last piece of bread. This shows how dangerous it can be to put such private information on public internet sites. So don't forget the quote sandwich. You know, I'm showing you these sophisticated things that you can do with quotes, but you still want to make sure you're using that quote sandwich of introduction, quote itself, and then say something about the quote, why you're using it. Let's look at one more example of flowing and not flowing. Frederick Lane, author of the book Internet Addiction, points out that for people not exercising self-control, quote, the internet can become a chronic temptation that destroys an individual's family life and career. So this flows grammatically correctly. We have our author's name, we have his credentials, we have the signal phrase, and so we can just put a comma here and then have our quote and then page number right there. And then our last piece of bread. This exemplifies, this is actually wrong. This should be, this exemplifies or this demonstrates that computers can be just as addictive as drugs. So here is our no, meaning it doesn't flow. Frederick Lane, author of the book Internet Addiction, makes a great point about the internet's destructive potential for people who lack self-control. And then we have our colon. The internet can become a chronic temptation. You know, here's our quote. So hopefully this is making sense to you that if your introduction is a complete sentence, put a colon. If not, and it just flows grammatically correctly into the quote, just put a comma. All right, so here is your first writing assignment. So this is using block quote format. So you want to quote the entire passage. This will be more than 4 lines within your paper. You want to quote the entire thing starting with the quotation marks. So you don't have to quote this part up here, but you need to quote everything in quotation marks. So that's going to be a long quote, a block quote. So make sure you're going back, either looking and bridging the difference on page 35, I believe it was. Yeah, page 35. Or going back to my list earlier in the lecture, or just Googling block quote format. And make sure you're following that list of format rules. So you want to use block quote format, but this is also a quote within a quote. So you have to also go back and either look at that earlier in the lecture, or you can find it also on page 35 in Bridging the Difference, the indirect quotation. So don't forget to put that QTD in. Don't forget to tell us who said this in your introduction, but also include what source it came from when you give the citation. So that's writing assignment number 1. So you can pause the video now and go ahead and complete that, and then we'll move on to writing assignment number 2. Okay, assignment number 2, you're going to quote from this passage below, and this one you don't have to do the whole thing. You can just pick 1 or 2 sentences, however you want to do it. But what I want you to do is practice taking words out and adding words. So whichever sentences you pick, I want you to add some words in using brackets, and I want you to take some words away using ellipses. So you're going to practice those two skills. Now, the other thing that I want you to do is with your introduction, make sure it follows the flow or no rule. So if however you set up the introduction to this quote flows grammatically correctly into the quote, remember you use a comma. If not, if your introduction is a complete sentence, then put a colon. Now notice this one doesn't have an author. So the other thing you're going to have to remember to do is, what do you do when you don't have an author? How do you cite it? And if you don't remember this, it's that you're going to use part of the title as if it was the author. So when I say part of the title, because this is a long title, you don't have to use the entire thing. You can just use the first two words. So you can have California School in quotation marks, and you'll use that as if it's the author. Now, if you're introducing it, go ahead and put the whole title just because it sounds better. But if you don't want to use the title in the introduction and you're just going to put all the information in parentheses, then the way you'll do it is just put these first two words in parentheses, and that shows us that that is where this quote came from, and I can match that up to your works cited page. All right, so now complete this writing assignment number 2, and then you'll be done with this particular lecture, and you'll have gotten some practice with using more sophisticated quotations, and that's going to help you when you go on to write your papers in Comp 102 and then in your upper level classes.